Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And today we are looking at a system that is honestly so invisible that most of us don't even realize it's running, but it dictates literally everything from your medical rights to how we explore the universe. We're looking at the system we use to classify existence itself.
Basically, we're talking about the line between the living and the dead.
We are.
So we are doing a deep dive into life's edge, the search for what it means to be alive by Carl Zimmer. And I want to set the table properly here, right at the top, because I think when people hear we're doing a biology book, they expect this polite review of chapters.
Yeah, right, a summary.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that is not what we are doing.
No, we are using the work as a data set, essentially. We're stripping it down for parts. We want to understand the actual architecture of how humans define life. Because the deeper you get into this source material, the more you realize that our definition of life isn't actually a biological reality. It's a negotiation.
A negotiation.
A messy and frankly desperate negotiation between lawyers and doctors and religious leaders and confused scientists. I mean, we have this idea that life is this bright, clear line. You know, you're either on the team or you're a rock.
Right.
But the universe just keeps scrubbing that line out.
And that's really the core conflict we're going to track today for you. We have these rigid human frameworks. You know, this is alive, this is dead. And then we have biology, which is just doing its own chaotic thing, completely ignoring our rules.
Exactly. And when those two things crash into each other, you get these really weird outcomes. You get viruses that conquer the entire planet but technically aren't alive. You get corpses that go through puberty. You get brain tissue growing in a lab dish that might actually conscious.
It gets incredibly sci-fi very quickly. So here is the trajectory for this deep dive. We're going to trace the design of this system, so how we actually try to measure life. Then we're going to look at the incentives, the money and the laws that force us to draw these boundaries in the first place.
Which is fascinating.
It really is.
Yeah.
Then we'll look at the outcomes, the absolute disasters that happen when the definitions fail. We'll trace the feedback loops and the persistence of the old rules. And finally, we'll look at the interconnections with emerging models like assembly theory, which is this mind-blowing new physics model that might finally solve the problem.
It is a lot to cover.
It is. So let's just start right at the beginning. The design of the system. If I put a gun to your head right now,
Please don't do that.
metaphorically speaking, of course,
Yeah.
if I forced you to tell me, how do you know something is alive? What do you say? Because I feel like for most of us, you just know it when you see it. A dog is alive, a chair is not.
Yeah, that intuition is what's often called the Potter-Stewart standard. I know it when I see it. And for 99% of human history, that was totally fine. If it runs away from you, it's alive. If it just sits there, it's a rock.
Right.
But as soon as we started looking through microscopes, that whole intuition just fell apart. So modern biology had to come up with a framework.
And that framework is essentially a working checklist.
It is. It's not a unified theory. It's not like E equals MC squared. It is literally a laundry list. In the source text, the author breaks down these functional hallmarks of life.
I actually have the list right here. It's metabolism, information gathering, homeostasis, reproduction, and evolution.
Right. So let's stress test this framework. Take a hummingbird.
Okay.
Does it have a metabolism? Yes, it burns sugar like crazy. Does it reproduce? Yes. Does it maintain homeostasis? Yes, it keeps its internal body temperature stable. So the checklist works. It connects the hummingbird to a giraffe or a fungus or a blue whale. The underlying unity is there despite extreme variation. They all check the boxes.
But I can already see the holes in this design.
Go on.
Well, take fire. Fire consumes energy, right?
Right.
So that's metabolism. It grows and reproduces when it spreads to new trees. It responds to stimuli like wind or fuel.
But it doesn't evolve. It doesn't
Right.
carry genetic information.
Okay, fair point.
Like-
But what about a mule? A mule is completely sterile. It cannot reproduce.
Yeah.
Is a mule not alive?
And that is exactly where the checklist system starts to creak under its own weight. If you follow the rules strictly, a lone mule is not alive. A grandmother who has gone through menopause isn't alive, and obviously that's absurd. So biologists have to say, well, the species reproduces, so the individual counts.
So you just start moving the goalposts?
They have to, because if they don't, the entire category just dissolves. This reliance on a functional checklist is actually a symptom of a much deeper problem. We don't actually know what life is. We only know what life does.
It feels almost like we're trying to define a movie by saying it has sound and color, but we've never actually seen a camera or a projector.
That is a perfect analogy. And historically, this desperation to find a thing that makes us alive, some vital flux or special protoplasm, it led science to some really wild places. The source material tells this incredible story from 1904 that I think perfectly encapsulates this design flaw in our thinking.
You're talking about the radio beads.
The radio beads.
This was honestly my favorite part of the historical section.
Yeah.
It reads like a steampunk horror movie.
It really does. So set the scene for yourself. It is 1904. We are at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. This is the absolute holy grail of physics at the time.
The center of the scientific universe.
Exactly. It's dark, it's full of mahogany and brass and these mercury pumps just chugging away. And everyone is obsessed with one specific thing.
Radium.
Radium. Marie Curie had just isolated it not too long before. And you have to understand, to the 1904 mind, radium was basically magic. It glowed blue in the dark. It produced heat seemingly from absolutely nothing. It defied the laws of physics as they understood them.
People went completely nuts for it. They were drinking radium water. They were wearing radium belts to cure arthritis.
They called it liquid sunshine. So into this feverish environment comes a scientist named John Butler Burke. And Burke has this idea. He thinks, well, life is energy, radium is energy, maybe radium is the spark of life.
It's a very classic Frankenstein premise.
It is. So he decides to do an experiment. He takes some beef broth, literally just a standard gelatin meat soup, and he sterilizes it. He boils it until everything inside is dead. Then he drops in a slightly radioactive radium salt. And he waits.
He's just staring into this test tube of soup.
And after a day or two, he looks through the microscope, and he actually sees something.
What does he see?
He sees these little shapes appearing in the broth, little spheres. And they aren't just crystals. They have a core and a little rind around the outside. And then as he watches them, they start to change shape, they elongate, they look exactly like they're dividing.
Like bacteria.
Exactly like bacteria reproducing. But they dissolve in water, which normal bacteria do not do. So he thinks, I haven't found bacteria. I have found something entirely new. He calls them radiobibs, radioactivity plus microbes.
And he legitimately thinks he's created life in a tube.
He thinks he has bridged the gap between the inorganic and the organic. He thinks the energy from the radium has organized the dead chaos of the beef broth into a primitive life form.
How did the world react to this? Because today, if someone claimed it on the internet, they would be torn apart by peers in 5 minutes.
Oh, the world absolutely loved it. This was front page news everywhere. The Daily Chronicle screamed "The Secret of Life" in massive headlines. Burke was hailed as a visionary genius. There was this profound feeling that science had finally peeked behind the ultimate curtain. We had found the link.
But he hadn't.
No.
Spoiler alert for 1904, I guess.
They were absolutely not alive. Years later, chemists figured out exactly what happened. The radium was emitting radiation, which was chemically tweaking the proteins in the beef soup, causing them to just clump together into these little shifting polymers. It was just complex chemistry. It was basically plastic.
It was a magic trick.
It was a visual performance, and this is why we're doing a systems analysis of this. Why does the author spend so much time on a failed experiment from over a century ago?
Because Burke fell for the visual. He fell for the aesthetic of life.
Exactly. Burke and the entire rest of the world had a fundamental design flaw in their perception. They defined life by movement and change. They saw something wiggling and growing, and their brains instantly shouted life.
We were looking for the performance of life rather than the actual structural mechanics of it.
Precisely. And you might think, oh, silly Victorians with their beef broth and their glowing rocks. But we are still doing this right now.
We are.
Every time we send a rover to Mars, what are we looking for? We're looking for things that look like cells. We're looking for chemical signatures that act like metabolism. We are literally still using Burke's logic, just with multi-billion-dollar microscopes. We are stuck on the hallmarks because we don't have a unified theory.
So the design of our classification system is flawed because it relies entirely on observation of traits rather than a fundamental theoretical understanding of what makes the machine run.
And that flaw isn't just an academic debate. It becomes a very practical, very messy problem when we have to make actual decisions. Because as we move into part 2 of this analysis, we have to realize we don't just define life out of philosophical curiosity.
We define it because we need to use it.
We define it because scientific institutions require operational definitions to guide research and funding and law and ethics.
Which brings us to the incentives. And honestly, this is the part of the source material that made me look at the medical industry in a completely different light.
You're talking about the invention of clinical brain death.
Invention is a pretty strong word.
It's the accurate word.
Okay, so let's go back to the 1960s. The checklist we just talked about works totally fine for a high school biology class. But in the hospital, The checklist was rapidly becoming a massive crisis.
A huge problem. And it was caused by a technological breakthrough. The positive pressure ventilator, the iron lung, basically. Before this machine existed, if your brain stopped, your breathing stopped. If your breathing stopped, your heart stopped. Death was a singular cascaded event. It all happened basically at once.
You were either here or you were gone.
But the ventilator completely severed that link. Suddenly, you could have a patient whose brain was completely destroyed, maybe from a gunshot or a car crash or a massive stroke. But the machine could force air into their lungs. That oxygenated the blood. And the heart, which runs on its own internal electrical pacemaker, just kept pumping.
So you have a warm pink body with a beating heart, but absolutely no brain activity.
The French neurologists called it coma dépassé, a state beyond coma. These patients were biological anomalies in the eyes of the law. Were they alive? I mean, the heart is beating. The checklist says metabolism check, homeostasis check.
But there's nobody home. The person is gone.
Right. Now, obviously, this was profound tragedy for the families involved, but it was a logistical nightmare for someone else, transplant surgeons.
This is where the story gets really dark.
It's where it gets pragmatic. In the late 60s, surgeons like Joseph Murray were finally figuring out how to successfully transplant kidneys and hearts. But to transplant an organ, you need a fresh organ. You cannot wait for the patient to go cold and stiff in the morgue. The tissue deteriorates too fast.
But if you take a beating heart out of a patient,
Under the law of 1967, you are committing premeditated murder. Even if the brain is complete mush, if the heart is beating, that person is legally alive. If you cut the heart out, you killed them.
so the surgeons were completely paralyzed by the system. They had the technology to save thousands of lives, but the legal definition of death was physically stopping them.
So what do you do when biological reality conflicts with your legal definition?
We changed the definition.
Enter the Harvard Committee of 1968. This is arguably one of the most significant moments in modern bioethics, and it just happened in a conference room. A doctor named Henry Beecher gathered a group of physicians, lawyers, and theologians to solve this exact problem.
And they were incredibly explicit about their goals, weren't they? They weren't hiding the ball at all.
Not at all. They published a report, and they listed two primary reasons for their work. One was to relieve the incredible burden on hospitals and families keeping these empty bodies running. And two was to clear the way legally for organ transplantation.
That feels incredibly utilitarian. It's basically saying, we need the organs to save other people, so we need you to be legally dead.
It is entirely utilitarian. The committee proposed what we now call the whole brain standard. Basically, they said, if your EEG is flat and you have no basic reflexes, you are dead. It does not matter if your heart is beating furiously. It doesn't matter if your skin is warm. You are legally a corpse.
And just like that, the boundary line moved.
Operationally, yes. It allowed the transplant boom to happen. It saved countless lives. But, and here is the crucial systems insight, they did not solve the biological mystery of death. They just created a legal and administrative loophole.
Because the body is still technically doing alive things on that table.
Exactly. The cells are metabolizing. And nature being nature eventually decided to expose that loophole. We redefined death to suit our medical incentives, but biology didn't get the memo.
We'll see exactly how biology fought back against that standard when we get to the outcomes section. But it's not just clinical medicine that has this incentive problem, it's space exploration too.
Right. Let's pivot to astrobiology and NASA.
So a somewhat similar dynamic happens later. NASA is gearing up for the Viking missions to Mars. They're going to land a multi-million-dollar robot on the red planet, specifically to look for extraterrestrial life.
And this presents a massive engineering constraint. If you tell a team of engineers, build a robot to find life, the first question the engineers ask is, what does the robot look for? It can't look for a dog or an oak tree. It needs a specific machine-readable signal to trigger a positive result.
It needs a very rigid definition.
Exactly. So in 1992, NASA convened a panel. Gerald Joyce and other top scientists sat down to create a working definition that would justify the entire mission architecture.
And what did they ultimately come up with?
The NASA definition. It's probably the most famous operational definition in science right now. They wrote, life is a self-sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution.
It sounds incredibly elegant. It sounds very authoritative and scientific.
It does, but look at the incentives driving it again. Why specifically Darwinian evolution?
Well, because that's what life on Earth does.
Yes, but also because if you define life that way, it perfectly helps you design the sensors for the probe. You look for replicating genetic molecules, you look for inheritance. It narrows an infinite search space down to something a robot can actually manage.
So just like the transplant, doctors needed a definition to allow for surgery. NASA needed a definition to allow for probe design and funding.
Precisely. The definition isn't necessarily a universal truth, it is a permit. It permits the scientific work to continue. It stabilizes the field so Congress can actually sign the check to build the rocket.
But what happens when you send that probe out, or you look in that microscope and you find something that completely defies the permit? What happens when the classification system strains under the weight of reality?
That brings us directly to part 3, the outcomes.
The edge cases.
The anomalies, the biological realities that make the Hallmark checklist look completely ridiculous.
Let's start with the anomaly that affects literally every single person on Earth, the ultimate outsiders, viruses.
The eternal debate. Are viruses alive?
I have to admit, before reading this deep dive, I was pretty sure they were. I mean, they make you sick. They spread from person to person. They evolve. We literally watched the SARS-CoV-2 virus mutate and bring the entire world to a halt.
They definitely check a lot of the boxes. Reproduction, yes. Evolution, absolutely. Information gathering, in a chemical way, yes, but
The metabolism box.
the metabolism box remains totally empty. A virus particle, which biologists call a virion, is completely inert. It's just a tiny geometric capsule of genetic data. If you leave it on a table, it doesn't eat, it doesn't breathe, it doesn't excrete waste. It is as biologically dead as a grain of salt.
Until it physically touches a host cell.
Right. And this leads to this massive classification crisis in biology. The source text mentions a statistic that is just staggering. There are more viruses in a single liter of seawater than there are human beings on Earth.
Wow.
If you weighed all the viruses on the planet, they would outweigh all other life.
So we fundamentally live on a planet of viruses.
We do, and yet our rigid classification system says, nah, they aren't in the club, not alive.
Which honestly seems incredibly arrogant of us.
It seems structurally wrong.
Yeah.
And this is where a virologist named Patrick Forterre comes in. He looked at this system and said, we are looking at this completely upside down.
Explain his virocell concept, because this completely blew my mind when I read it.
So normally our framework dictates virus attack cell. The virus is the tiny dead invader. Forterre says no. The inert virus particle is just the seed. It's like a spore or a piece of pollen. The real living organism is the cell after it has been infected.
So when the virus hijacks the cell's machinery?
That new combined entity, the cell, that is now ignoring its own survival to churn out millions of virus copies, that is the living virus. He calls it the virus cell. The virus becomes the organism.
That completely flips the script. It means the thing isn't the life form, the process is the life form.
Exactly. And our classification system, our whole noun-based checklist, is terrible at handling processes. It wants discrete nouns. It wants the virus, not the infection. So the system fails on the microscopic scale. What about the weird scale? Let's talk about organoid.
The brain in a dish.
This genuinely feels like something pulled from a dystopian sci-fi novel. We're talking about labs like Alice in Mootrees. The technology they are using is incredible. They take a stand-alone skin cell from a human, maybe you. They chemically reverse engineer it back into a stem cell. Then they coax that stem cell to become a brain neuron. And then they let millions of these neurons grow together in a nutrient soup.
And they naturally form these little three-dimensional balls, the organoids.
Right. They are essentially pea-sized chunks of human brain tissue.
But they aren't just dead lumps of meat. They are electrically active. The text points out they produce complex brainwaves.
Very complex brainwaves. When researchers hook them up to EEG sensors, the patterns look remarkably similar to the brain activity of a premature human baby. And even more disturbingly, if you put these organoids under clinical anesthesia,
They actually go quiet.
the electrical brainwaves settle down just like a patient on an operating table. Then you watch the anesthetic dregs out of the soup and they wake back up again.
That is just horrifying to think about.
It creates an absolute crisis for our definitions. Because is this organoid alive? Well, it's made of human cells. It's metabolizing sugar. It has coordinated neural activity. But it has no body. It has no senses. It has no physical experience of the world whatsoever.
Gentine Lunchoff, the bioethicist mentioned in the book, had a brilliant quote about this exact problem. She warned that these things are not in the catalog of philosophers.
We simply don't have a conceptual box for disembodied human neural network. It exposes a massive gap in our logic. We define human life by the integrated organism. But here we have the machinery of life running perfectly without the chassis.
So we have viruses that are dead but act alive. We have organoid brains that are alive but have no body. But the biggest failure of the system, the one that really hurts on a human level, takes us right back to that Harvard committee decision from the 60s.
The Jahi McMath case.
We really need to spend some time here, because this isn't just an abstract scientific anomaly. It's a profound human tragedy that exposes the absolute fragility of the rules we rely on.
It is. Jahi McMath was a 13-year-old girl living in Oakland. In 2013, she went into the hospital for a routine tonsillectomy to help with sleep apnea. It's a surgery thousands of kids get every year without issue.
But it went terribly wrong.
Horribly wrong. She suffered massive hemorrhaging after the surgery. She lost an immense amount of blood. She went into cardiac arrest, and her brain was completely starved of oxygen for an extended period.
The doctors stabilized her body, but they did the neurological tests. And under the 1968 Harvard standard, that whole brain standard we talked about, she was dead.
She had a flat EEG. She had no brainstem reflexes, no ability to trigger a breath on her own. The state of California legally issued a death certificate. In the eyes of the system, she was a corpse.
But her family absolutely did not accept it. They looked at her in the bed, and she was warm. Her heart was beating steadily on the monitor. So they fought the hospital. They eventually got her moved to New Jersey, which crucially has a religious exemption clause for brain death.
And this is exactly where the medical definition shatters against biological reality. They kept her on a mechanical ventilator. They gave her basic nutritional support through a tube. And her body didn't decompose.
It didn't just not decompose, it lived.
It thrived in a strictly biological sense. For 4 years, her immune system actively fought off infections. Her body healed bed sores and physical wounds. She maintained her own internal body temperature. And most shockingly of all, she went through puberty.
I think we really need to pause on that fact. A legal corpse went through puberty.
Think about what human puberty actually entails mechanically. It is a massive, system-wide hormonal cascade. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which signals the ovaries, which release estrogen, which fundamentally changes the body's bone structure and tissue development. It is a symphony of biological coordination.
And the Harvard definition explicitly says if the brain is dead, the entire body is dead. But Jahi McMath proves that simply isn't true.
Her brainstem was completely destroyed. The autopsy scans eventually confirmed that beyond any doubt. But the rest of her body, what we call the somatic organism, was furiously alive. It was growing. It was actively developing into a young woman.
So we have a documented situation where a person is legally a corpse, but biologically developing.
It forces us to confront the noble lie of the 1968 committee. They tried to perfectly equate the loss of personhood with biological death. They tried to make them happen at the exact same millisecond. But Jahi McMath physically proved that they are two entirely different things. The person, the consciousness, and the identity may have been permanently gone, but the organism was still fighting.
And the administrative system has absolutely no way to handle that reality. We want a clean break. We want dead to mean biologically stop.
And biology just refuses to stop on our schedule.
So we have a classification system that fails on viruses, fails on lab organoids, and fails on clinical death. And this leads to what we're going to call the feedback loops. Because when the system breaks, scientists don't just throw their hands up and give up. They try to fix the definition.
They try to patch it. It's exactly like pushing software updates to a broken app.
But the updates aren't working.
No, they aren't. We see this endless loop play out. A provisional definition is made, an anomaly is discovered, everyone panics and argues, a new definition is proposed, and then a new anomaly breaks that one.
Take the famous Martian meteorite.
Allen Hills 84001. This is the classic modern example of the feedback loop failing. In 1996, NASA scientists find this chunk of rock from Mars sitting in the ice in Antarctica. They crack it open, and under an electron microscope, they see these microscopic little worm-like shapes.
It was a massive deal. President Bill Clinton gave a live televised speech about this. He said, we might not be alone in the universe.
The height was completely off the charts. But then the scientific community tried to actually apply the definition to the rock. Remember the NASA definition from 1992?
Yeah.
A self-sustained chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution.
Was a petrified rock. It's certainly not evolving anymore.
Exactly. You cannot see Darwinian evolution happening in a billion-year-old fossil. You can only see the physical shape left behind. So the operational definition was completely useless. It led to 20 years of bitter arguing. Is it a fossilized worm? Is it a weird crystal formation? Is it just dried Martian mud? The definition didn't solve the problem at all. It just framed the boundaries of the argument.
And this endless arguing leads to a massive proliferation of definitions. The source material mentions a researcher named Edward Trifonoff who actually went out and tried to count them all.
He scoured the scientific literature and he found 123 different published scientific definitions of life.
123.
Imagine if structural engineers had 123 different definitions of steel. You couldn't build a single bridge. One scientist says life is about replication, another says it's about thermodynamics, another says it's about cell membranes.
It's an absolute mess.
Radu Popa, a microbiologist, quoted in the text, flat out said, "This is intolerable for any science. It clearly shows we are deeply, fundamentally confused."
There's a study from London University mentioned that basically says most working scientists have just given up entirely. They rely on what they call family resemblance.
The vibe check approach to biology. It looks like life, so I'll treat it like life. It's intellectually lazy, but practically it's all they have to work with.
But there is a much better way to understand this confusion. And this was the moment in reading this deep dive where I felt a massive click in my own brain. The water analogy presented by philosopher Carol Cleland.
Yes, this is the philosophical anchor of the whole debate. Cleland argues that biology right now, regarding the definition of life, is in the exact same state that chemistry was in during the Middle Ages.
We are essentially alchemists.
We are. Think about how a medieval alchemist defined water. They didn't know about atoms or molecules, so they defined water entirely by its properties, by what it did. It's wet, it's transparent, it dissolves salt, it freezes when it gets cold.
It's a good checklist.
It's a hallmark checklist. And just like with biology, the checklist failed them constantly. What about nitric acid? It's wet, it's clear, and it dissolves things. Is nitric acid water?
Obviously, no.
What about ice? It's completely solid, not liquid. What about steam? It's a gas. The alchemists got hopelessly confused because they were trying to define the descriptive properties rather than the underlying substance.
And then came the actual structural theory.
Molecular theory. Once scientists discovered that water is structurally H2O, two hydrogen atoms bound to one oxygen atom, all the confusion instantly vanished. Ice is just H2O locked in a crystal lattice. Steam is just H2O moving extremely fast. We didn't need a checklist anymore because we understood the fundamental structural architecture.
And Cleland is arguing that we simply haven't had our H2O moment for life yet.
Exactly. We are still compiling lists of properties, metabolism, reproduction, homeostasis, because we don't have a structural theory of what life actually is. We are endlessly describing the symptoms of life, not the root cause.
So how do we actually get to that H2O moment?
Yeah.
That brings us to part 5, new models, and specifically assembly theory.
This is genuinely the most exciting part of the modern research for me. This is the work of scientists like Lee Cronin and Sarah Walker, and they are attempting to move biology away from chemistry and into physics.
We want to stop looking for specific ingredients like DNA or carbon and start looking for complexity itself.
Right, because if you think about the basic laws of physics, the universe loves to break complex things down. That is entropy. If I throw a fully built Lego castle onto the floor, it shatters into individual bricks. But if I put those bricks in a box and shake it for a billion years, it will never accidentally build a castle.
The universe destroys order by default.
Correct. So Cronin argues that life is the only physical system in the universe that consistently builds castles. Life creates highly complex order out of random chaos.
So how do you actually measure that without relying on a checklist?
They developed a metric called the assembly index. It's a rigorous mathematical way of asking how many specific directed steps did it take to build this particular molecule.
Like, how many times do I have to purposefully snap a Lego brick together to get this exact shape?
Exactly. And through massive computational modeling, they found a magic number, a literal threshold.
15.
15 steps.
Why 15? Is that just an arbitrary cutoff they picked?
No, it's entirely probabilistic. Cronin calculated that for very simple molecules, random chance in basic chemistry can easily make them. Lightning hitting a mud puddle can randomly forge basic amino acids. But as the molecule gets bigger and more complex, the statistical odds of it forming by pure accident drop exponentially.
It's like the infinite monkey with the typewriter thought experiment. The monkey mashing keys can easily type the letter A. It might eventually type the word the.
Yeah.
But it will never mathematically ever accidentally type the entire script of Hamlet.
Exactly. And the math shows that molecular Hamlet begins at 15 steps. If you find a molecule anywhere in the universe that requires more than 15 distinct assembly steps to form, and you find a large abundance of them, you can be 100% statistically sure that random chance didn't make it.
Something purposeful had to build it. A system with a blueprint. A system with stored information.
And that information-driven system is what we call life.
This completely changes everything for alien hunting, doesn't it?
It entirely frees us from our Earth bias. We don't need to look for DNA. We don't need to look for water or carbon. We could send a probe to Titan scoop up some weird freezing silicon sludge and just put it in a mass spectrometer. If the molecules in the sludge have an assembly index over 15
It's
Gs,
alive, even if it looks absolutely nothing like us.
it creates a structural definition based on the physics of information rather than a descriptive definition based on earthly biology. It is arguably the closest thing we have to the H2O moment.
It's incredibly compelling. And here's part 6, the persistence of the old systems. We aren't actually using assembly theory in hospitals or labs yet. We are still aggressively using the Hallmark checklist. We are still using the 1968 brain death standard.
We are. The old systems endure.
Why? If the old system is so demonstrably broken, if the Jahi McMath case disproves brain death, and viruses completely disprove the checklist, why does it persist so stubbornly?
Persistence in human systems is almost always about utility. We keep the old flawed definitions because they continue to function administratively.
It goes right back to the incentives we talked about earlier.
Exactly. We still need to harvest and transplant organs every single day. That underlying medical need hasn't changed at all. If the medical establishment officially admitted that Jahi McMath was biologically alive, the entire legal framework for the global transplant industry would instantly collapse. Surgeons would have to legally stop taking hearts from brain-dead patients.
And the transplant wait lists would explode, and thousands of people would die.
Right. So society implicitly agrees to a noble lie. We all collectively agree to pretend the boundary is a sharp, clean line because acknowledging the biological ambiguity is simply too legally and morally expensive.
And this interweaves with so many other massive systems. Look at general medical ethics.
End-of-life care completely relies on these fragile lines. Insurance companies need to mathematically know exactly when to stop paying for a hospital bed. You cannot bill Medicare for a corpse.
And look at synthetic biology research. Lee Cronin, the guy who pioneered assembly theory, he's also building these weird blue droplets in his lab.
Right, the inorganic chemical droplets. They're basically oil droplets that actively chase each other around a petri dish. They divide, they metabolize chemical fuel. But they have absolutely zero DNA.
Are they alive?
Under the traditional Hallmark checklist, maybe. It's heavily debated. Under assembly theory, not yet. But if he engineers them to pass step 15, then we have literally created artificial inorganic life in a lab. And then what happens? Do those droplets have legal protections? Can a grad student just turn them off and pour them down the sink?
And astrobiology as well.
The biggest existential risk of persistence is that we miss what's actually out there. If we rigidly cling to the 1992 NASA definition, we might land a probe on the ice moons of Enceladus, look at a massive chemical plume and say, oh, it's just weird water, when in reality it's a vast swarm of alien nanobots or a complex silicon-based consciousness.
We are literally filtering the infinite universe through our own bureaucratic limitations.
We absolutely are.
Which brings us to the final intersection, philosophy and the law. Because as I was reading the Jahi McMath case, it struck me that it mirrors the ongoing abortion debate perfectly.
It really does. Structurally, it is the exact same crisis, just located at the opposite end of the human timeline.
We are culturally obsessed with defining personhood.
We desperately want to know precisely when a developing fetus becomes a person with rights. And we want to know precisely when a brain-dead body stops being a person with rights. We want these to be cold, hard scientific facts. We want a biologist to walk into a courtroom and definitively state at exactly week 12, day 3, personhood begins.
But biology categorically cannot do that.
Because biology is a continuous spectrum. It is an incredibly slow, messy slope from a single cell to a fully formed baby. And it's a slow, messy slope from an adult to a decomposed corpse. There are no bright lines in nature.
But the legal system requires bright lines to function.
So we artificially invent them, we draw lines in the sand, and then we act shocked and angry when biological reality completely ignores our lines.
We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today, from the glowing radium labs of 1904 to the transplant wards of the 60s to the complex math of assembly theory. So I have to ask the defining question we promised at the start of this deep dive.
Go for it.
What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is that we are assuming life is a clearly bounded physical category simply because our human language treats it as one. We have a single word life, so our brains naturally assume there is a corresponding physical box in the universe that contains all living things and absolutely nothing else.
But that box doesn't actually exist.
The box is a total fabrication. The obscured layer here is that our definition of life is just a provisional tool built from hallmarks. It is not a unified truth. It is a pragmatic heuristic we use to navigate the world. We see a tiger, we classify it as alive, we run away. We see a rock, we classify it as not alive, we sit on it. That works brilliantly for basic survival.
But when we try to use that crude monkey survival tool to understand the fundamental mechanics of the universe,
It fails completely. Surface interpretation looks at the world and assumes absolute clarity. You are alive versus you are dead. But a systems analysis reveals that there is structured ambiguity everywhere. The boundary between life and non-life isn't just blurry. It is actively under reconstruction by the universe at every single moment. We are fundamentally trying to draw a permanent line on moving water.
and maybe that is the final provocation we should leave everyone with. We keep searching endlessly for the secret of life. We look for the exact spark, the thing that makes us biologically special.
And we might just have to accept the reality that life as a discrete scientific fact might not even exist. It might just be a conceptual overlay that human minds impose on the universe just to manage the sheer terror of its complexity. We're ultimately just ordinary matter organized in a very specific, high-information way doing complex things. The label life is strictly for us. It's not for the atoms.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.